Montana Territory, autumn of 1875. The rains hit different on the high plains, and Jim Anders learned that his first October when he woke to find his wool blanket soaked through and weighing 3 pounds heavier than the night before. He had set up his bedroll exactly the way every cowboy on the range was taught to do it. Canvas tarp thrown over his blankets to shed the rain, standard and trusted. By morning he was shivering. His blankets had lost their warmth, and he needed 3 times the firewood just to get warm again. Across the Montana foothills, trail hands and cattle drivers were waking up to the same misery and bedrolls built by the book and failing every wet night. Over the next year, Jim quietly adapted an old technique that kept his blankets dry while others stayed soaked. The other hands called his setup fussy pioneer gear until they saw him rise warm and alert after the worst downpours. What did he understand about where the water was really coming from that every cowboy today should know? The logic seemed foolproof to any newcomer riding into a Montana cattle outfit. When the afternoon thunderstorms rolled across the sagebrush foothills, every veteran cowboy would tell the same story. Throw your canvas tarp over your blankets when the sky opens up and the water hits the canvas first while you stay bone dry underneath. The 18-ounce canvas tarps that came standard with most bedrolls were built heavy enough to shed a hard rain, and the ranch supply catalogs all recommended the same approach. Keep your bedding under cover, the manuals said, and you would wake up ready for another day in the saddle. Jim Anders had followed that advice to the letter during his first months with the outfit. The tarp went over his wool blankets every night, pulled tight at the edges and weighted down with stones or gear to keep the wind from catching it. When the frequent overnight ground moisture settled into the mountain glades, he figured his waterproof layer would handle whatever the weather brought. The method had worked for decades of cattle drives, and every experienced hand on the range swore by it, but ground moisture moved differently than anyone expected. After a typical night with light drizzle and heavy dew, Jim would wake to find his blankets noticeably heavier and cold against his chest, even though not a drop of rain had touched them directly. The dampness seemed to come from below, seeping upward through the canvas and into the wool fibers that lay directly against the tarp's underside. What should have been a waterproof barrier had become a condensation zone, trapping moisture between the ground and his bedding. The failure made more sense once Jim understood the mechanics. Damp ground air and overnight dew created a layer of humid air that the tarp trapped underneath, while the canvas itself became cold enough to cause condensation on its lower surface. The moisture had nowhere to go except into the blankets, where it destroyed the wool's insulation value and left him shivering through the night. A fellow cowboy sleeping nearby had measured his blankets one morning and found them carrying nearly 4 pounds of extra water weight after a particularly heavy dew. Jim brought different knowledge to the problem than most of the crew. His father had worked logging camps near the Montana-Wyoming border, and Jim had spent 2 seasons in the Idaho Panhandle timber country before joining the cattle outfit. In the logging camps, the Scandinavian foreman insisted on laying canvas ground sheets under sleeping gear to cut the connection between bedding and cold, wet earth. The principle was simple: create a barrier beneath the sleeper, not just above. He had also worked alongside Crow Nation guides during hunting expeditions in the high country. The indigenous hunters routinely placed hide or canvas sheeting under their bedrolls in damp meadows, treating ground moisture as the primary enemy rather than overhead rain. One elder tracker had explained that overnight dew and groundwater would soak through any bedding that touched the earth directly, no matter how waterproof the top covering might be. When Jim began experimenting with a bottom tarp system, the reaction from other cowboys was swift and dismissive. Bill Carson, the veteran trail boss, watched Jim lay his canvas flat on the ground before spreading his blankets on top and shook his head with amusement. "We've always thrown the tarp on top and been fine," Carson told the other hands. "This greenhorn's carrying an extra canvas sheet under his bed when we don't need one." The crew nicknamed Jim's setup Fussy Pioneer Gear and questioned why anyone would bother with the extra weight and bulk when the proven method had worked for years. The social pressure was real, but Jim's early results kept him committed to the experiment. His first attempts were crude, simply laying the canvas tarp on the ground and placing his blankets directly on top. then using either a second smaller canvas or folding up the edges of the bottom tarp to provide some overhead protection from rain. The system was not yet refined, and he experienced several failures that taught him important lessons about proper execution. One particularly frustrating night taught him that tarp quality mattered more than he had realized. After a heavy dew, he woke to find the surface of his blanket saturated because the thin canvas he had chosen for ground cover had allowed moisture to seep through at weak points in the weave. The next morning, he upgraded to a thicker, more tightly woven tarp that could handle ground contact without compromising the moisture barrier. He also learned that the tarp needed to extend beyond the edges of his blankets to prevent water from wicking up around the perimeter. Another early failure showed him the importance of proper sealing. During a night of steady rain, runoff had flowed beneath his bottom tarp. Because he had left the side edges loose and unsecured, the water pooled under his bedding and soaked through from below, defeating the entire purpose of the ground barrier. He began folding the long edges of the tarp under his blankets early in his setup routine, creating a waterproof perimeter skirt that directed water away from his sleeping area. The learning process took months of trial and adjustment. Jim tested different tarp materials, experimented with various ways of securing the edges, and gradually developed a systematic approach to site selection and layout. Each failure taught him something new about how water moved and where the vulnerabilities lay in his evolving system. Carson and the other veterans continued to mock his elaborate setup, but Jim noticed that fewer of them were complaining about his performance during the long, cold mornings when their conventional bedrolls left them stiff and shivering. By late autumn, Jim had refined his bottom barrier approach into a reliable system that consistently outperformed the standard method. His blankets stayed noticeably drier, he required less firewood to warm up in the mornings, and he maintained better energy throughout the demanding days of cattle work. The principle that drove his innovation was becoming clear. Instead of just defending against rain from above, he was addressing the real source of moisture problems that came from below. The difference between a dry bedroll and a soaked one often came down to 3 feet of ground selection. Most cowboys would ride into camp at dusk, spot the first patch of level earth that looked comfortable, and roll out their bedding without a second thought about what lay beneath the surface. Jim Anders watched this pattern play out night after night as his fellow trailhands chose campsites based on convenience rather than drainage, then woke up puzzled by blankets that seemed to absorb water from nowhere. The worst mistakes happened in the most obvious places. Flat spots at the base of sagebrush clusters looked inviting after a long day in the saddle, but these natural collection points gathered runoff from the surrounding higher ground. Even a slight depression that was barely visible to the eye could funnel overnight dew and ground moisture into a sleeping area. One cowboy had rolled his bedroll into what appeared to be perfect level ground near a gentle swale, only to discover by morning that his blankets had absorbed nearly 3 pounds of water from capillary action and surface flow that pooled beneath his sleeping area during the night. Jim's approach to site selection drew from 2 distinct traditions that most cowboys had never encountered. The Crow Nation hunting guide who had worked with their outfit the previous season, a tracker named White Feather, had shown Jim how indigenous hunters chose their sleeping spots in damp mountain meadows. The principle was elevation. Even a rise of 6 inches above the surrounding ground would allow night moisture to flow away rather than collect beneath a sleeper. White Feather explained that water always seeks the lowest point, and a bedroll placed in that lowest point would inevitably become water's destination. The second influence came from Jim's logging camp experience in the Idaho Panhandle. Sven Larsson, the Swedish foreman who had supervised winter timber crews, insisted that his men sleep on slight slopes whenever possible. Larsson had seen too many loggers wake up sick and useless after nights spent in flat camping areas where ground moisture had no way to escape. "Water that cannot run away will run up," Larsson would tell his crews, pointing to the way damp earth would wick moisture into any fabric that made direct contact with level ground. Jim began applying these lessons systematically during the spring cattle drives of 1876. Instead of accepting the first convenient spot, he would spend a few minutes walking a small area and reading the subtle contours that determined water flow. He looked for natural ridges in the sagebrush country, even rises as minimal as half a degree of slope, that would encourage any surface moisture to drain away from his bedroll rather than pool beneath it. When camping near meadows, he sought out the slightly compacted ground along game trails where the earth was firmer and less likely to hold standing moisture. The technique required adjusting his entire setup routine. On sloped ground, Jim learned to place his bottom tarp with the head end slightly uphill, which allowed his body heat to rise naturally while preventing moisture from pooling around his feet. He discovered that tucking the downhill edge of the tarp under his blankets created a small dam that directed water flow around his sleeping area, rather than under it. This modification grew directly from his observation that even perfectly waterproof tarps could be defeated by runoff that found its way beneath the barrier at vulnerable edges. When the terrain offered the right materials, Jim incorporated a third technique that came from old-world logging traditions. Scandinavian timber camps had used raised sleeping platforms to break the connection between bedding and cold, wet ground, but those permanent structures were not practical for cattle drive camps that moved every few days. Instead, Jim adapted the principle by creating temporary insulation layers when lodgepole pine or other suitable vegetation was available near the campsite. The process involved gathering pine boughs, dried grass, or even thick layers of sagebrush that he could spread beneath his bottom tarp to create a mat 6 to 8 inches thick. This natural platform served multiple functions. It broke the direct contact between his tarp and the earth, provided additional insulation against ground cold, and created air spaces that prevented capillary action from drawing moisture upward into his bedding. The technique required extra time and effort, but Jim found that it could reduce overnight moisture absorption by more than half compared to a tarp placed directly on bare ground. One particularly educational night taught Jim the importance of perimeter water control. He had selected what seemed like an ideal campsite on a gentle slope with good drainage, but steady rain during the night created more runoff than the slope could handle quickly. Water began flowing beneath the edges of his bottom tarp because he had not sealed the perimeter effectively. By morning, he discovered that runoff had pooled under one corner of his bedroll and soaked through his blankets despite his careful site selection. The failure led to an important refinement in his technique. Jim began folding the long edges of his bottom tarp under his blankets early in his setup process, creating what functioned as a waterproof skirt around his entire sleeping area. This modification directed surface water around the perimeter of his bedroll rather than allowing it to flow underneath. Combined with proper site selection, the sealed perimeter made his ground barrier system nearly foolproof against both standing moisture and moving water. The results of Jim's site selection methods became measurable during a week of particularly wet weather in late June. While most of the crew complained about blankets that gained 2 to 3 pounds of water overnight, Jim's careful attention to slope and drainage kept his moisture absorption to less than half a pound per night. His blankets retained their insulation value. He stayed warmer through the cold hours before dawn, and he required significantly less firewood for his morning warming fires. Charlie Moore, one of the younger cowboys on the crew, began watching Jim's site selection process with growing interest. Moore had suffered through several miserable nights in poorly chosen flat spots and started asking questions about how Jim identified the subtle drainage patterns that made the difference between dry and soaked bedding. Jim showed him how to read the slight variations in ground level, how to identify natural ridges and swales, and how to predict where overnight moisture would flow. The conventional wisdom among most cattle crews held that site selection mattered little as long as a cowboy had good waterproof canvas over his blankets. Jim's systematic approach proved that understanding ground drainage and elevation was just as important as having proper materials. Water that could not escape from beneath a bedroll would inevitably find its way into the blankets, regardless of how waterproof the top covering might be. The standard cowboy bedroll relied on a single heavy wool blanket that weighed 12 to 14 pounds and was considered sufficient insulation for most weather conditions. Ranch supply catalogs promoted this approach as practical and economical. One substantial blanket meant less bulk to carry and fewer pieces of gear to manage during the constant packing. An unpacking of trail camp life. Most cowboys accepted this wisdom without question, purchasing the heaviest wool blankets they could afford and assuming that more weight automatically meant better warmth. Jim Anders discovered the flaw in this logic during a cold snap in early October of 1876 when temperatures dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for 3 consecutive nights. His single heavy blanket, despite weighing 13 pounds, could not maintain warmth once ground moisture began affecting its lower layers. The wool fibers closest to his bottom tarp absorbed dampness and lost their insulating capacity, creating cold zones that conducted heat away from his body even while the upper portion of the blanket remained relatively dry. The solution came from two sources that challenged conventional frontier thinking. Sven Larsson, the Swedish logging foreman, had insisted that his timber crews use 3 or 4 lighter blankets instead of one heavy one during the harsh Idaho winters. Larsson explained that wool's insulating power came from trapped air between fibers, and multiple layers created more air pockets than a single thick blanket could provide. When one layer became damp, the others continued insulating while the wet layer dried from body heat and air circulation between the blankets. White Feather, the crow guide, had shown Jim how indigenous hunters in the high country used layered hide and wool systems that could be adjusted throughout the night as conditions changed. Rather than committing to one fixed level of insulation, the layered approach allowed a sleeper to add or remove individual blankets as temperature and moisture conditions shifted. This adaptability proved crucial during nights when ground moisture, air temperature, and wind conditions all changed between sunset and dawn. Jim began experimenting with a 3-blanket system that weighed roughly the same as his original single heavy blanket, but distributed the insulation differently. His bottom blanket, weighing about 5 pounds, made direct contact with the waterproof tarp and served as the moisture management layer. The middle blanket, also 5 pounds, provided the primary insulation barrier against cold air. The top blanket, slightly lighter at 4 pounds, handled temperature regulation and could be partially opened or closed as needed throughout the night. The layering technique required understanding wool's natural properties in ways that most cowboys had never considered. Wool fibers could absorb moisture up to 30% of their weight while still providing insulation, but only if air could circulate between the fibers to promote evaporation. In a single thick blanket, moisture that penetrated the lower layers stayed trapped and created cold, damp zones that expanded throughout the night. With multiple thinner blankets, moisture could migrate laterally between layers and evaporate more efficiently. Testing this system, through the autumn cattle drives, Jim measured dramatic improvements in both warmth retention and moisture management. His 3-blanket setup typically gained less than 1 pound of water weight overnight, compared to the 2.5 to 3 pounds that single heavy blankets accumulated under similar conditions. More importantly, even when his bottom blanket absorbed some moisture, his body temperature remained stable because the upper layers maintained their insulating capacity. The technique also solved problems that Jim had not anticipated when he first developed his bottom tarp system. During particularly cold nights, he discovered he could create additional insulation by loosely layering the blankets rather than pulling them tight against his body. The loose arrangement trapped more warm air while still allowing moisture to move between the layers. When temperatures rose or when his body heat increased during the night, he could compress the layers for better moisture transfer without losing warmth. Charlie Moore, who had been observing Jim's methods with growing interest, decided to test the multi-blanket approach after a particularly miserable night when his single, heavy blanket left him shivering and damp. Moore purchased 2 additional blankets from a traveling supply wagon and began using Jim's layering technique. Within a week, he reported that his blankets stayed noticeably drier and that he required significantly less time in the mornings to warm up by the fire. The success of the layered system created an unexpected challenge: how to cover the blanket stack without trapping moisture underneath while still providing protection from rain and wind. Jim's early attempts used a single canvas tarp pulled tight over all 3 blankets, but this approach created condensation problems as body heat and moisture vapor became trapped against the underside of the canvas. Wet nights were particularly problematic as the sealed cover prevented moisture from escaping upward, while the bottom tarp prevented it from draining downward. Jim solved this problem by adapting tent-making techniques that he had learned from immigrant craftsmen in the logging camps. Instead of sealing his top cover completely, he began using a canvas sheet that could be adjusted for different weather conditions. On clear, still nights, he left the cover loose and elevated at one corner to allow warm air to escape. During rain, he could pull the cover tighter, but still maintained small gaps that prevented complete sealing. The breakthrough came when Jim realized that his top cover should function more like a roof than a sealed container. He began securing one corner of his canvas cover to a short stake driven into the ground about 8 inches away from his blankets, creating a small peak that allowed air circulation while deflecting rain. This arrangement let warm, moisture-laden air rise and escape, rather than condensing back onto his blankets. During a week of testing in late November, the vented cover system reduced moisture accumulation by nearly 40% compared to a sealed arrangement. Jim's blankets gained an average of only 0.6 of a pound of water per night, while maintaining internal temperatures that were 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than blankets under sealed covers. The improved air circulation also meant that any moisture that did accumulate dried more quickly during the day, reducing the total weight of his bedroll and preventing the musty odors that plagued many Cowboys' gear. Trail boss Bill Carson, who had initially mocked Jim's elaborate setup, began asking pointed questions about the multi-blanket system after noticing that Jim consistently performed better during cold mornings when other hands were sluggish and stiff. Carson's own heavy blanket had been giving him trouble during the recent cold weather, and he quietly purchased an additional blanket to test Jim's layering approach. Within 2 weeks, Carson was recommending the technique to other members of the crew, though he never publicly acknowledged that his original skepticism had been misplaced. The evolution of Jim's blanket system demonstrated that effective insulation required more than just heavy materials. Understanding how moisture moved through wool, how air circulation affected evaporation, and how multiple layers could be managed independently proved far more important than simply buying the thickest blanket available. The most dangerous moisture came from within. Even cowboys who had mastered ground barriers and layered blankets could wake up soaked in their own condensation if they sealed their bedrolls too tightly against the night air. Jim Anders learned this lesson during a still, humid evening in late August, when no wind stirred the sage and the air hung heavy with moisture from an afternoon thunderstorm. Despite his carefully developed system of bottom tarps and multiple blankets, he woke at 2 in the morning with his outer blanket layer damp and clammy from trapped body heat and breathing moisture. The problem was invisible but measurable. A sleeping human produced roughly 2 pints of water vapor during an 8-hour night through breathing and perspiration, moisture that had to go somewhere. When cowboys pulled their canvas covers tight against rain or wind, that vapor condensed on the inside surface of the cover and dripped back down onto the very blankets it was supposed to protect. Jim discovered that his blankets could gain an additional pound of water overnight from internal condensation alone, even when his ground moisture barriers worked perfectly. The solution required understanding airflow patterns that most frontier dwellers had never considered. White Feather had explained how Plains teepees managed internal humidity through carefully designed air circulation systems. The conical lodge shape created a natural draft that drew fresh air in near the ground and pulled warm, moist air up and out through the smoke hole at the peak. Even in heavy rain, the teepee maintained some ventilation to prevent condensation buildup that would soak the interior. Jim adapted this principle by creating intentional air movement through his bedroll system. Instead of sealing his canvas cover completely, he began leaving strategic gaps that allowed air to enter at ground level near his feet and exit at the elevated head end. This created a gentle circulation pattern that carried away moisture-laden air before it could condense and return to his blankets. The technique required balancing ventilation against heat loss, opening enough space for air movement without creating drafts that would chill him during cold nights. Maritime tent-making traditions provided additional techniques for managing internal humidity. Immigrant sailors who had worked on Great Lakes shipping brought knowledge of canvas shelter systems designed to handle confined spaces where condensation could be deadly. These men understood that fabric shelters needed both ridge venting and eave gaps to prevent moisture accumulation, principles that applied directly to bedroll construction. Jim experimented with a dual vent system that used 2 separate air paths to manage internal climate. He created a lower ventilation channel by propping up the foot end of his canvas cover with a short stick, allowing cool air to flow in near his feet. At the head end, he secured the cover with a cord and small stake positioned to create a ridge vent that let warm air escape without allowing rain to enter. This arrangement established continuous airflow that prevented stagnant air pockets where condensation could form. The technique required seasonal adjustments that few cowboys understood. During warm summer nights with high humidity, Jim opened his ventilation gaps wider to increase air circulation and prevent condensation from overwhelming his system. In cold winter weather, he reduced the vent openings to conserve heat while maintaining just enough airflow to prevent moisture buildup. The balance point changed with temperature, humidity, and wind conditions, requiring constant fine-tuning throughout the changing seasons. Testing during a series of humid September nights revealed the dramatic impact of proper ventilation. With sealed covers, Jim's blankets gained an average of 1 4/10 pounds of water per night from internal condensation. With his dual vent system operating, moisture gain dropped to 4/10 of a pound, a reduction of more than 70%. The improved air circulation also meant that any moisture that did accumulate evaporated more quickly during the day, keeping his gear lighter and preventing the musty odors that plagued poorly ventilated bedrolls. Charlie Moore, who had been following Jim's innovations closely, experienced the condensation problem firsthand during a particularly still night when he had pulled his canvas cover tight against a light drizzle. He woke to find his middle blanket layer soaked with condensation that had formed on the underside of his cover and dripped down throughout the night. After Jim showed him the ventilation principles, Moore modified his own setup to include both foot and head vents, immediately noticing improved comfort and drier blankets. The ventilation system also solved unexpected problems with blanket temperature regulation. Jim discovered that trapped air under sealed covers became superheated during warm nights, causing him to sweat excessively and soak his blankets from the inside. With proper air circulation, his bedroll maintained a more consistent temperature that prevented overheating while still retaining necessary warmth during cold periods. This temperature stability reduced the moisture load his ventilation system had to handle. Advanced techniques emerged as Jim refined his airflow management through the winter of 1876. He learned to create cross-ventilation by opening vents on opposite sides of his bedroll during calm nights, establishing air currents that more effectively carried away moisture. During windy conditions, he could use the natural air movement to drive ventilation by positioning his openings to catch prevailing breezes and direct them through his bedroll system. Trail cook Samuel Peterson, who had worked on logging crews and understood the principles of camp ventilation from chuck wagon design, began observing Jim's techniques with professional interest. Peterson recognized that Jim was applying industrial camp ventilation principles to personal gear, creating engineered airflow that most cowboys achieved only by accident. Peterson started recommending Jim's ventilation methods to other crew members, lending additional credibility to techniques that had initially seemed overcomplicated. The most sophisticated aspect of Jim's system involved adjusting ventilation based on weather forecasting. When afternoon conditions suggested overnight fog or heavy dew, he increased his vent openings to handle the additional moisture load. Before storms that would bring wind-driven rain, he positioned his vents to maintain airflow while preventing water infiltration. This predictive approach required reading weather patterns and understanding how atmospheric conditions would affect the internal climate of his bedroll. By December of 1876, Jim's ventilation system had evolved into a responsive climate control method that automatically adjusted to changing conditions throughout the night. As temperatures dropped and his body generated less heat, the reduced air circulation helped conserve warmth. When morning brought rising temperatures and increased humidity, the enhanced airflow prevented condensation as his bedroll warmed. Cowboys who had initially dismissed his methods as unnecessarily complex began asking for detailed explanations of his ventilation techniques. The principle behind Jim's success was deceptively simple. Moisture management required air movement, and air movement required intentional design rather than accidental gaps. Cowboys who relied on random air leaks and uncontrolled ventilation found their bedrolls either too drafty or too humid, never achieving the precise balance that kept blankets dry while maintaining warmth. Jim's systematic approach to airflow engineering provided that balance through every season and weather condition the Montana range could produce. November of 1876 brought the kind of weather that separated working systems from failed theories. A massive moisture-laden storm system moved in from the Pacific Northwest, settling over the Montana foothills for 36 hours of continuous precipitation that shifted between driving rain, wet snow, and freezing drizzle. Ground temperatures fluctuated around the freezing point, creating conditions where saturated earth alternately froze and thawed. producing maximum moisture migration into any bedding that made contact with the surface. The storm caught 3 separate cattle crews camped within 2 miles of each other in the Yellowstone River drainage, providing an unintentional field test of different bedroll systems under identical weather conditions. Jim Anders and his outfit were positioned on a slight ridge overlooking a natural meadow, while 2 other crews had established camps in the more protected but lower-lying areas near creek bottoms and swales. Temperature measurements taken by the outfit's trail bosses showed the storm's severity. Air temperatures dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit during the worst night, while ground temperatures remained near freezing due to thermal mass from the saturated earth. Wind speeds reached 25 miles per hour, driving moisture horizontally and creating conditions where conventional overhead protection proved inadequate against water infiltration from multiple directions. Cowboys using standard bedroll methods experienced catastrophic system failures that went beyond simple discomfort. Tom Bradley, a veteran hand with Bill Carson's crew, found his single 14-pound wool blanket had absorbed nearly 5 pounds of water by dawn, transforming his insulation into a heat-conducting mass that drew warmth away from his body faster than he could generate it. Bradley showed early signs of hypothermia, uncontrollable shivering, slurred speech, and confusion about simple tasks like building his morning fire. The moisture infiltration patterns revealed the fundamental flaws in conventional wisdom. Water attacked the traditional tarp-over-blanket systems from 3 directions simultaneously. Ground saturation wicked upward through direct contact. Wind-driven rain penetrated the edges of overhead tarps, and internal condensation formed when body heat met the cold, sealed canvas covers. Cowboys who had placed their bedrolls in low-lying areas for wind protection discovered that these locations became collection points for runoff that pooled beneath their tarps and soaked through their blankets from below. Firewood consumption during the recovery period provided measurable evidence of system failure. The conventional crews burned an average of 4 cords of wood equivalent per man during the morning after the worst night, desperately trying to generate enough heat to warm their soaked blankets and restore their core body temperatures. Several cowboys had to abandon their regular duties for half the day, focusing entirely on drying gear and recovering from exposure-related exhaustion. Jim's integrated system performed under conditions that overwhelmed every individual component when used separately. His site selection on elevated ground prevented runoff accumulation, while his bottom tarp barrier stopped ground moisture infiltration even when the saturated earth beneath reached maximum water capacity. The 3-blanket layering system distributed moisture absorption across multiple insulation zones, preventing any single layer from becoming completely compromised. Most critically, his ventilation system continued operating throughout the storm, preventing the internal condensation that devastated sealed bedrolls. Quantified measurements revealed the dramatic performance differences. Jim's blanket stack gained 0.6 of a pound of water during the 36-hour storm period, compared to the 4 to 5 pounds gained by conventional single blanket systems. His internal bedroll temperature remained 4 degrees Fahrenheit, higher than neighboring cowboys, while his morning recovery required only 1 cord equivalent of firewood compared to their 4 cords average. These differences translated directly into work capacity. Jim remained fully functional throughout the crisis, while several conventional system users required medical attention for exposure symptoms. The storm's aftermath created the first systematic adoption of Jim's methods beyond individual curiosity. Charlie Moore, who had been experimenting with components of Jim's system, became a vocal advocate after witnessing the complete system's performance under extreme conditions. Moore began teaching other crew members the site selection principles, demonstrating how subtle ground elevation differences had protected Jim's camp, while their low-lying positions had created disaster. Trail boss Bill Carson faced a practical crisis that forced him to abandon his skepticism about Jim's elaborate methods. 3 of his most experienced hands were operating at reduced capacity due to exposure-related exhaustion, while valuable gear required replacement or extensive repair. Carson quietly approached Jim for a complete explanation of his bedroll system, taking detailed notes on each component and asking specific questions about implementation costs and setup time. The technical knowledge transfer revealed the systematic nature of Jim's innovations. Each component of his system reinforced the others, creating redundant protection against moisture infiltration that remained effective even when individual elements failed partially. Cowboys who tried to adopt only pieces of the system discovered that incomplete implementation provided minimal benefits. The bottom tarp barrier was ineffective without proper site selection. Layered blankets provided limited improvement without ventilation control, and ventilation systems failed without moisture barriers to prevent infiltration. Samuel Peterson, the experienced trail cook, began incorporating Jim's principles into the chuck wagon's equipment recommendations for crew members. Peterson recognized that the bedroll system represented engineering thinking applied to frontier problems, creating solutions that were measurable, repeatable, and teachable to new hands. He started including ground tarp barriers and layered blanket systems in the standard gear lists provided to incoming cowboys. Word of Jim's system spread through the informal networks that connected cattle crews across the territory. Cowboys who had witnessed the November storm's aftermath carried detailed descriptions of Jim's methods to other outfits, where trail bosses dealing with similar moisture problems began requesting specific information about site selection criteria, blanket layering techniques, and ventilation management. The system's reputation grew based on quantified performance differences rather than theoretical advantages. The adoption process revealed how frontier innovation spread through practical demonstration rather than formal instruction. Cowboys who had suffered through nights of soaked blankets and morning exhaustion were motivated to learn techniques that provided measurable improvements in comfort, warmth retention, and gear longevity. The complexity that had initially discouraged adoption became acceptable when the alternatives proved consistently inadequate under challenging conditions. By spring of 1877, modified versions of Jim's bedroll system had appeared in 3 different cattle outfits operating in the Montana Territory. Trail bosses began specifying bottom tarp barriers as standard equipment for new hires, while experienced hands experimented with multi-blanket layering and ventilation techniques adapted from Jim's original innovations. The transformation from individual experiment to accepted practice had begun, driven by measurable results rather than theoretical arguments.